So when you are setting boundaries, when you're setting expectations, when you're setting, you're really describing what values mean in your organization. They're not just pretty bullet points on the wall, but here's what those values look like in action. When you give that kind of clarity to your team, that is empathetic.
You're listening to the No Labels, No Limits podcast with best-selling author Sarah Box. We focus on the mantra, no labels, no limits, no excuses. And now, without further ado, please welcome your commanding coach with plenty of chutzpah and heart, Sarah Box.
Hey there, No Labels, No Limits podcast listeners. Welcome back. You know, here at the No Labels, No Limits podcast, we are all about diving deep into stories that shape us and discovering our limitations, or what we think they are, and recognizing that they're often just the beginning of a new journey. And so today we're going to be joined by a truly inspiring guest, Maria Ross. Now, before I hit record, Maria and I realized we have so many thoughts similar. So I know this is going to be fun. I just can't wait to have her just go on about all she's learned. But, you know, let me tell you a little bit about her. She is a keynote speaker, an author, a strategist, and in addition to that, an unwavering advocate for empathy. And she's going to talk about empathy and how we understand it and how sometimes we don't understand all of it. But her journey is marked not just by her achievements, but also by her profound resilience. So at 35, get this, you guys, she had a life-threatening brain aneurysm, and it threw her whole life into disarray. Can think about what that would mean in your life if all of a sudden you had an aneurysm and everything changed for you. But what happened at that time was she actually learned crucial lessons about decision-making and the real essence of empathy. And now she shares those lessons in her new book, which we're going to talk about also, called The Empathy Dilemma. This, I find, is a fun little fact about Maria. She is a British crime enthusiast, but more than that, she says it also, that passion of hers often rivals her professional pursuits. So with that, let me formally welcome Maria to the podcast. Hi, Maria.
Hi, happy to be here.
Well, first, I want to ask you just a broad question.
Yeah.
What change are you here to support in the world?
I'm here to help people understand that empathy is a strength and not a weakness, because we desperately need more of it in our world. And if you can help people embrace empathy as a superpower, it can transform their lives.
So you put in there that oftentimes we think of empathy as weakness. So let's go back and talk about your journey through your brain aneurysm, what you learned about empathy, and maybe how what you learned changed, what you thought about it as you move forward.
Yeah, so I was rocking along as a marketing executive and then built my own business in 2008 around brand strategy consulting. And we had just moved to Seattle, just bought our first house, just adopted our first dog. Things were crazy, but things were going along. And I was struck down by a ruptured brain aneurysm. And that basically pulled me out of my life, I like to say. So everything you think is important isn't. It stops, right? I left client meetings hanging. I left, things unfinished, and the sky didn't fall, right? So luckily I had a miraculous recovery, because what I had was one of the most severe versions of an aneurysm rupture and a stroke called a subarachnoid hemorrhage. And I like to say the brain ninjas saved my life. But it was a long recovery road. I had impaired vision for immediately after the aneurysm. My retinas experienced a hemorrhage because it was so severe. And so that I had to have surgeries around that. I had some progress and then some setbacks through my whole journey. But I spent 6 weeks in the hospital and then went home and began recovery, began some outpatient care, in-home therapies. And like I said, kind of made a miraculous recovery. The Cliff Notes version, I have a book called Rebooting My Brain that tells the whole story. But and then I got back into my life again. And what I uncovered was that, our experience in the hospital, barring the fact that I almost died, was wonderful. We were treated with so much respect and I was treated with so much dignity at a really vulnerable time. And because of that, I decided to volunteer for the hospital as a patient advisor when I got well again, or mostly recovered. And I discovered that it wasn't an accident, that it wasn't just because I was lucky enough to have really nice people on my care team, because, it's a hospital. Of course, everyone's really empathetic. That's not the way it works. What I discovered is that the hospital actually subscribed to this philosophy called patient and family-centered care. And any of your listeners in healthcare are probably familiar with it. It puts the patient and their family at the center of the experience, which seems kind of like duh, but what that means is that it's operationalized empathy. It's intentional empathy. It's putting them at the center of the experience and then making policy decisions, training decisions, communication decisions based on that input, based on that perspective of another person. And when they do that, it's actually really good for the bottom line. It's not just great for the patient experience. It lowers costs, it lowers readmission rates, it improves medical outcomes. And so I got really curious about that and kind of tucked that away as a brand strategist. It was kind of interesting to me. And a few years later, I had my first son, and he was about 2, and I was reading all these stories to him about how to collaborate and how to share and how to be a good person and be empathetic, when meanwhile, in our world, are examples of cultural, business, political leaders was horrendous. And I thought, what's the point of teaching him all this? If this is the world of role models he's going to grow up in. So I decided to do what I do, and I just researched it. I said there have to be brands and leaders who are winning with empathy, because I saw it work at the hospital. So there's got to be other stories. I was delighted to find all the data and the research. And that all culminated into 2 years of research and study, went into my first book, The Empathy Edge, where I made the business case for empathy, that empathy is not just good for society, it's great for business. And then from that work, I began doing leadership trainings, keynotes, talking to leaders. I launched a podcast. And then what I discovered was people said, great, we're on board with this whole human-centered leadership thing, but here's where we struggle, especially in a post-pandemic world. Here's where we're struggling. And so the new book, The Empathy Dilemma, is how to help successful leaders balance performance, people, and their own personal boundaries, their own mental health, because that's really where the struggle was with people trying to embrace empathetic leadership. So long-winded answer, but that's how we got here.
That's a beautiful answer. I really appreciate it, because you pull a lot of nuances out of the whole thing with empathy. It's easy to say, be empathetic, be authentic. Yeah. It's like, there are reasons people don't do that or don't do it well, or, the resistance towards it, whether it's implicit or explicit, right? So when you talked about like making the business case for it, that is a great way to open the door to people saying, it's not just a fun or nice thing to do.
Right.
It's helpful for your business. So what are some of the different kinds of businesses and the return on investment your research found?
Yeah. So I think it might be helpful to go back to sort of the lens through which I do my work, which is, what are we talking about when we're talking about empathy? Because that is greatly misunderstood. And that's actually getting in the way of leaders and colleagues at work embracing it. So empathy is the ability to see, understand, and where appropriate, this is important, we'll probably talk about this later, feel another person's perspective, and further use that information to then act with compassion. So compassion is empathy in action. When I gather all this information about your context and your perspective and your point of view, what do I do next? What's the next right thing to do? And that action can look so different. There's hundreds of different ways you can take action, especially in a workplace. You can just listen. You can make space. You can give someone time to process. You could give them a hug. It doesn't mean you have to, change your tough business decision because you're trying to be empathetic. You can help them through a tough business decision by being empathetic. And so that's really, it's not about being nice. It's not about caving into unreasonable demands. And it's not even about agreeing with someone. It's about taking the time and having the presence to be able to see someone else's point of view, understand what they might be thinking and feeling, what they might need, and then taking a next right step in order to do that. And nowhere in there does it mean we, have to sacrifice our mental health, or that we have to just do what someone else says, or that we have to be a doormat. So given that context, the research, there's just treasure troves of data and studies that show just across these vectors, when you have an empathetic leader or an empathetic leader or culture, you boost engagement, performance, customer retention, customer loyalty, innovation. There's some really, if we want to get geeky and get into some stats, I've got stats for you about the innovation that empathetic cultures can achieve versus non-empathetic cultures. And it doesn't mean this. I think this is very important, especially, given your work with nonprofits, because in my research for the first book, I actually discovered that some nonprofits have the worst cultures because they're so depleted doing the work and the mission that internally it's a mess.
Yeah.
And so it's really about understanding that you have to build that environment in order to have an even bigger impact on the outside.
So I want to acknowledge the truth of what you just said. It is a mess oftentimes because folks within that culture are trying to help others external.
Mm-hmm.
So all their focus is there, and then they do get depleted. And I've had more than one executive coaching session or team building session where we talk about that. It's like, well, we have to do this. And just even pausing to say, really, so what happens if you don't?
Yeah.
Well, I'll feel bad. Okay. But no one's making you do that. So,
right.
but it's really an unraveling, and I can laugh about it, but it's, when we're talking about it, it's heavy because it's on people's hearts. No, I'm supposed to do this, or these people will suffer. So will you talk about our misunderstandings? Like, how are the different, you mentioned different ways of empathy.
Yeah. Yeah. So there's,
describe that.
Sure. There's actually two kinds of empathy. There's cognitive empathy, which is where we use our head, right? That's where I imagine what something might be like for you. We engage cognitive empathy when we hear news about, a refugee of war, or, someone who's been hurt in an accident, or, we engage like, oh, what must that be like? We do that when we hear about somebody experiencing a death in their family. I offer you my sympathies. Like it's this cognitive exercise. Emotional or affective empathy is when we actually share the emotions. We're connecting with our emotions with the other person. So you come to me and you're anxious and scared, and my palms start getting sweaty. My heart rate starts racing. I start taking on those feelings because I viscerally feel them. For me, I don't know about you, but for me, this really shows up. I'm a huge dog lover. And this shows up for me when I pass missing dog posters.
I don't look at them anymore.
I instantly start crying because I can totally feel what that person's feeling. And then after I had a kid, I can totally feel that when I hear about a mother in distress, or, someone's child who's in danger. Like, I can't even watch, you said I watch British crime dramas, but I have to turn it off if it's anything related to a child being kidnapped or harmed. Like, I can't do it anymore. So
that's when I say, can you mute this? I'll be back in an hour.
Yeah, exactly. Mute it. I want to hear what happens at the end, right?
Just tell me when I can come back in the room.
Exactly. So I think understanding those two things and how we can access those two things to tap into our empathy, even if we think we're not good at empathy, because we as humans are actually wired for empathy. It's been proven. But the muscle atrophies for some people, or they think differently. Neurodiversity comes into play. We access empathy in different ways. So, when you have someone who's an extreme empath, for example, or like we were talking about earlier before we started recording, a highly sensitive person, they're really heavy in their affective empathy. And that can be paralyzing for them at times because they're not able to compartmentalize and then focus on the work or on the mission, and still treating someone with compassion and respect, but protecting their own mental health. And this is why, like for the new book, I spoke to a neurosurgeon who saves lives. I spoke to a police captain who's had to go into active shooter situations. I spoke to an emergency room nurse. People that have to make these choices between empathy and action in a split second.
Yeah. And so you've spoken with those. I live with one of those. And so for me, it's like, okay, there's an immediate crisis here. And then I watch, there's no panic. This is what we need to do. And I'm thinking, okay, I'm wanting to, like, my adrenaline goes up, right? Because I'm connected.
Yeah.
Going on. I'm thinking, no, we need to just do this.
Yeah. Oh, that's great.
But I asked, how do you do that? And he goes, you compartmentalize. He goes, you look and you don't take it on because you're there to do a job.
Right.
And you're there to serve. So it's like that empathy
Right.
And so, which is why so many of those folks carry trauma if they don't deal with it, right? Because
Exactly.
it doesn't go away. You've compartmentalized it, but it's sitting there heavy.
Exactly. And I think that's why, what the common thread I noticed across those people, because the second book, The Empathy Dilemma, is all about presenting 5 pillars of effective and empathetic leadership. How can you be an effective and an empathetic leader and not lose your soul in the process, right? And these were 5 common threads I found across all these different people from different industries, from different walks of life, from the hundreds of interviews that I've done, that some of them didn't even really know how they were doing it. I had to sort of deconstruct the recipe from them.
Because it was natural food.
Yeah, it was not for some of them. Yeah. Some of them did work on it though. Some of them had admitted like, oh, this is something I've actually worked on in my career. But to your point, clarity and decisiveness came up a lot. Those are 2 of the pillars within people that have to make these split-second decisions because they're able to keep their eye on the ultimate goal, which is actually in service of someone else, right? So a doctor, the ultimate goal is to save someone's life. A police officer, the ultimate goal is to keep as many people safe as possible. And so they're making these decisions. And a great quote I heard from my emergency room nurse was, I work the case, but I treat the patient. And just that ability to like, yes, they're here, but I'm going to do these things that I know are going to ultimately help me get to my goal. And I'm still doing it. I can still be respectful. I can still be, like me with my brain injury. Our neurosurgeons were extremely empathetic, but I don't want that empathy clouding someone's judgment in the moment they're doing life-saving surgery. That doesn't help me. It doesn't help my family. And the neurosurgeons that I've talked to, they say that's exactly it. We have to focus on the task at hand. We can be empathetic with the patient and the family in another moment when the crisis has passed.
So let's take it back into leadership. And you mentioned that a number of these folks actually learned and you identified these pillars. So you've named 2 of them. What are the other pillars?
Yeah. So I'll just review them quickly. It's self-awareness, self-care, clarity, decisiveness, and joy is actually a common thread that I found across how people are leading their teams with empathy and still achieving high performance. So, it's one of those things where I'm trying to give people a guide that, hey, if you're struggling with being empathetic and you feel like people are walking all over you, or you feel like standards have slipped because you're trying to be empathetic, the answer is not to bounce back to command and control and being a cold automaton. The answer is to maybe look at one of these pillars and see if one or 2 of them are a little weak. And then I give people actionable strategies for shoring them up.
So when people have done that, have they come back to you and shared like, okay, I worked on this. This is what happened. Or because I know you work with leadership and you're talking as well. So what feedback, since you've done this work, have leaders given to you?
Well, it's been really interesting because I think one of the biggest value I can give to them when I'm doing these workshops or I'm doing these keynotes is the awareness of it. I think we're all walking around a little bit blind. And so that awareness helps them take a pause and learn how to respond rather than react. And in some ways, kind of override their natural tendencies or their self-preservation. But this is why, self-awareness and self-care are the first 2, because if we don't have our own house in order, we have no room to be empathetic and take on another person's point of view without defensiveness or fear. And I think that has been a big aha for a lot of the leaders that I worked with, that like, I didn't realize I was just barking orders at my staff. And it was because I was depleted. My tank wasn't full. And, think about, for me, raising kids, when I'm tired and hungry, my kid is super annoying to me. I just can't deal with it. Yeah, totally hangry. And like, you're not your best self, right? And so we have some of these leaders walking around, not getting enough sleep, not getting good nutrition, and just self-care in general. Like, what lights them up? What recharges their battery? Is it knitting? Is it prayer? Is it rock climbing? Are they making the time to pursue something that replenishes them? Because you can't do it on fumes, right? So some of the other things I've heard, this was a great story I heard after I wrote my first book, is I went to an event and a young woman came up to me. I would say she was probably a younger millennial, maybe older Gen Z. And she said, your book, my friend, it was like a friend story. She said, my friend was really unhappy in her role at work. And she felt like her boss was constantly talking over her and not considering her ideas and not giving her opportunity to participate. She read the book and she marched into her leader's office and handed the book to her leader. This takes chutzpah, right? Hands the book.
What a gal.
I know. I love it. Hands the book to her leader and says, this is what's going on for me. We've had several conversations about this. You need to read this book. We're going to discuss it. And if you haven't read it in 2 weeks and we discuss it, I'm leaving. Like, that's amazing, right? And then the boss actually did read it and realized these behaviors that they had just not even seen. And it was, again, probably because of, I don't know what the causes were, but I could guess it's probably because of overworked, stressed, not self-care, not being self-aware of how their actions were impacting other people. And so she ended up staying because this leader was open enough and put ego aside enough to say, maybe there's something I need to work on here.
Yeah, and even if you're not sure if there is, just show the respect to say, okay, I'll check it out.
Exactly. Because what happened, we all know bully behavior comes from fear and insecurity. And if we have a leader that does not have a growth mindset, they can't embrace empathy because they're going to assume their perspective is always the right one. And empathy requires you to see other perspectives. Again, empathy is not just being nice. It's actually understanding someone else's point of view. And if I don't think any other point of view is valid but my own, I can't access my empathy.
Boy, that's so powerful. And when you're talking about like not taking care of yourself enough, it doesn't take, you can be in a great headspace for weeks on end, and then all of a sudden you just slip. You think, okay, I only have these 2 back-to-back meetings before my 3rd meeting. I feel good right now. And it's 9 a.m. But when that noon meeting comes, you're like, and this happens to me. I had to just, at my last team meeting, I said, okay, I'm not trying to be critical, you guys, but honestly, I failed. I haven't drunk, I haven't had any water. I haven't really had breakfast because I thought this would go faster. And so I'm a little depleted right now.
Right.
We all work together a lot. So it's like everybody gives folks grace, it's just how it is, but you got to own it.
But that's actually a great example. When we talk about, there's people that believe falsely that empathy has no place at work. But what you described right there is empathy. It's not just crying on the floor with your employees. It's actually being self-aware enough to say, hey, I'm running on empty right now. And then clarity, communicating that to your team so that you all can adapt and be resilient to that. And so this is the wonderful thing about empathy. Does not have to be this very emotional, heavy lift all the time. Empathy is career progression maps for people so they know what to expect and how to advance. Being clear about what their next step is. That's empathy, because that's saying, what does this person want to know? If I were that person, what would I want to know about how I can get ahead here? Empathy is, again, clarity in roles and expectations, because you can't hold someone accountable to an expectation you've never set. So when you are setting boundaries, when you're setting expectations, when you're setting you're really describing what values mean in your organization. They're not just pretty bullet points on the wall, but here's what those values look like in action. When you give that kind of clarity to your team, that is empathetic. When you give people, personal mental health days, that's empathetic. So it's all these other things other than, I don't want to be empathetic at work because I don't want to be over emotional.
Well, if we're honest and we recognize how we feel, because part of this is something I want to test with you, but I think if we recognize where we are at, it's easier to receive and not react.
Yes.
And it's okay to say, we were in the middle of a creative session when I said, my tank is empty, right? So I'm supposed to be creative, and all I can think of is, all this is doing is creating more work for me, and I'm not sure why, right?
Right. You were reacting very negatively to it.
Inside my head, I'm thinking, stop it. But then I said,
no more ideas.
I said, what I think would be really helpful to me is I asked, can this guy and I, let's just meet on Monday and spend a deep dive on all this and bring it back to the team next week. And let's get everybody's input, but I don't have it to they could go on, but they're going to look to me and say, well, what do you think? And I'm thinking, nothing. So Nothing.
Right. And so actually that is empathy for them, because you knew you weren't going to be showing up as your best self for them. And it would be creating a negative experience for them. And so that's why that's empathetic, to be able to call it like that and say,
Well, I don't want to have to go back and apologize for being a jerk and pretend I never knew it happened.
right, exactly.
Just
I
because,
love it.
it's like I get to be a jerk, but no one else, because I'd call someone on it. So
Right.
I don't call myself.
And that's why I love that you said that, because that's actually what empathy is about. It's about understanding someone's context before you make assumptions. So we do it all the time. And by the way, I just want to point out, I'm an empathy expert, but I'm not an expert at empathy all the time. Like, just ask my kid, just ask my husband. It's always a work in progress for all of us. So I'm not being so sanctimonious, like we all have to do it this way, because I'm horrible at it on some days. But I think when we understand someone's context, so if we're having a conflict with someone at work, for example, or we're having a budget debate, and I'm saying we should, or a strategic decision debate, and I think we should do this and you think we should do that. Maybe it's about taking a beat, and instead of so much like, here's why I'm right and you're wrong, which is us talking at each other, we engage in curiosity and we listen. So you and I are having a disagreement about a strategic direction. I need to pause and say, Sarah, let me give you the floor for a minute. Talk to me about what you think about that strategic direction, and why you think yours will get us to our goal, and why you think this one is not the right way to go. And without judging, let me give you some floor time to tell me where you're coming from. And I might uncover, like you said in your example, it could be you actually agree with me, but you're having trouble at home. You're dealing with an elderly parent. You're dealing with a medical crisis at home. I might uncover that maybe in your past job, you did a similar initiative to what I'm recommending, and it went horribly wrong. But if I don't dig in and try to understand where you're coming from and why you feel the way you feel, why you believe what you believe, we can't move forward together. It doesn't mean I have to agree with you.
Right.
This is the thing, like, it's not about agreement, but now I have more information so that maybe we can find common ground, move forward, and I don't just assume you're a horrible person. And I think that's what's happening right. And it's happening. I've done it in the workplace too, where I didn't try to understand someone's context. And I'm like, that person was a total jerk. But then there's been other times that I've been able to go, I'm having some friction with this person. Why don't I invite them out for coffee? Why don't I just get to know them a little bit? And I might uncover, something that's going on that has nothing to do with me, that's impacting their work and impacting how they show up in that work. Yep. And we're moving too fast. We don't give each other and ourselves enough grace for that.
I try a little game in my head when someone, like, what I might say is, why are you such a jerk? I mean, there was no call for talking to that person that way or whatever. Yeah. And then I think, so I make up a story about them, which is, bet they're doing that because they're on their way to a hospital because someone they really love is hurting and they don't have the time for me. And so why would you assume that? I said, because I'd rather assume goodwill about them than think that they're really a jerk or that they're just taking it out on me without knowing more. And since I'm not going to learn more at this moment.
Right.
I'm going to assume the best.
I love that. That's actually part of what I learned in my recovery from my brain injury, was the whole cognitive behavioral therapy was all about that, was like actually examining your emotions and then taking a moment to think of alternatives to what that narrative was that you're telling yourself, and then reassessing your emotion after you do that. And, this is how you can get out of road rage. And did you notice when your tank is full, it's easier for you to do that?
You recognize that your self-awareness score goes up.
Right.
You're in the moment. You're paying attention. When you're getting triggered. I know when someone triggers because I can feel it in my body. But if I'm not attuned, or if I haven't been taking care of myself, I'm already guarded, so I can't feel it.
What's interesting? That whole thing that's a piece of the self-awareness component, is knowing your emotional triggers. And that's something that, in my 50s, I'm still discovering, more emotional triggers.
But you'll be discovering in your 60s. Too.
I know. But I remember speaking with one CEO of a company who, over time of doing this personal development work and actually doing some self-assessments, that's what I advise in the book for self-awareness, is you don't have to figure it out all on your own. Take some assessments. Take Clifton Strengths Finder, take Enneagram, take a few things and have someone facilitate that or coach that for you. What she realized over her career was that one of her emotional triggers where she reacts badly as a leader is when she thinks she's not being believed. So you've seen this moment where someone says you said something or you sent something to them, right? And you know you didn't. And they're like, I don't believe you. So what do? You frantically go back to your sent mail, muttering under your breath, going, I'm going to find that email that I sent, blah, 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 blah. And then you send it off and you go, see, I told you I wasn't imagining this, right? When it really could just be a misunderstanding. It doesn't have to be. And so what she learned was, I don't have to feel attacked when someone says they don't believe me. I can just have a conversation and say, why do you think that? Let's go back through our communications. Let's, and just deal with it in a much more positive manner. So I just thought that was a really interesting one. And I bet a lot of leaders have that as well.
Yeah, because it's easy to feel attacked. Or when someone says, well, you said this. Mm-hmm. Now, here's what I've learned is oftentimes because I'm going fast in my head, I probably did say it and didn't pay attention. Yeah. So if someone says, well, Sarah, you said this, I'm giving them at least 70%. I am, because I've been, like my husband's got this photographic memory and he goes, no, remember you said this? I go, I have no memory of that because it's behind me. Right. So I go, can you tell me where we were when we had that conversation? Sure. And then it comes back to me because I anchor. So, but I just like, okay, it's likely I said that. I'm on it because if I get going fast, like you say, you're not grounded, you're not self-aware, and you're just talking or doing stuff. You forget what comes out of your mouth.
Right. But you have the self-awareness around that.
Well, I've been
Yes.
So how many times you want to
works in progress, remember?
But I'll tell you that what's really fun, Len, you said this early on in our interview, as you said, stay curious. And you can stay curious without having to blame yourself or others and just go, whoops, I didn't recognize that until now. And now I recognize it and I can do better.
Well, and you can do it with confidence. This is the thing is it's like, again, I don't want to be weak. So I don't want to admit, but no, you just the way you said it just now, like, oh yeah, actually I was wrong. You're right about that. That's a very different way of approaching it than like, oh, I'm so sorry that I did it. I'm a horrible person. Like, oh, you can do it. You can have that self-awareness with confidence of like confidently owning your flaws, confidently owning your emotional triggers, and then moving forward from there.
Well, and sometimes they're funny.
Sometimes they're funny, right?
Well, why are you getting all your knickers in a twist, Sarah? It's true. Let it go.
Totally. And I think that it's also about really understanding how to, again, where the filling your tank helps is, can I distance myself and my worth and my value and my intelligence from the thing that's actually happening in front of me? And that's where the curiosity can come in. That's where, they talk about this in meditation circles and Buddhist teachings. Can you look at the action as something separate from you and go, it's kind of interesting. Why did I blow up when that employee came into my office asking me for that? Why did I do that? What was going on for me? And getting reflective. And that's what we mean by getting curious, is that it doesn't just happen and you forget about it, but can you reflect on both the good things that happen and the good interactions and why did that go well? And then also the things that didn't go so well. Like, why did that not go well? What happened there? Let's trace back to a root cause.
And then you can decide what to do about it, right? Mm-hmm. And so that leaves you, or me in this instance, if I'm talking about myself, I'm in charge. I get to see how I show up, and do I want to show up with more empathy and be real about what's going on? And one thing I like that you emphasize is it's not about bearing your soul. It's about being real and recognizing in the moment.
Yeah. Recognizing that someone else has a perspective and a lived experience and a point of view, and it's equally as valid as your own.
Well, and it's so much more fun when you do that.
Yeah.
There's this one woman I know who, she runs a nonprofit. She's an amazing leader. I don't know that she would say that about herself, but everybody who works with her does. But part of what it is she is very clear. And when she's not clear, she knows she's not clear. But, and she recognizes where she might, quote unquote, drop the ball. But she has built over time this amazing team around her that are all self-empowered, right? With clear responsibilities and expectations. It's not like, okay, you get to do whatever you want. They are the most loving, team. They respect each other. They hang out together, like each other. But it's just that vibe, right?
Yeah.
I admire how she does that, and she's just very honest.
Well, and I love that. And that's why joy is the fifth pillar, is because it's not about being funny. It's not about like the work's going to be joyful at every second and every moment. It's about creating a sense of levity and a sense of community so that, again, everyone doesn't have to be best friends, but I've met a lot of my best friends at work. And those were some of the most rewarding work experiences I had because, to connect the dots when you feel seen, heard, and valued by other people, when you can relax with them and be yourself, you're going to perform better. You're going to be more engaged. Performance is going to go up. I was telling you earlier, there's studies that show innovation goes up because I'm not in self-preservation mode.
Right.
I'm actually open to laughing at myself or making mistakes or, so if you can create that environment, like it sounds like the person you're talking about, create that environment of levity and camaraderie, it actually goes a long way because now I want to be more empathetic to you because I like you, or I just at least enjoy being around you. And it doesn't mean we're going to be friends forever, but there's studies out there. There's a woman named Shasta Nelson, who is an expert in friendship. She's written several books about friendship, and her last book was about the business of friendship and how the studies and data around what it does for your organization when you encourage people to have a friend or even have a best friend at work, and what that does to performance, engagement, motivation, absenteeism, what it does to in certain circles, what it does to whether safety is adhered to or not. When you have that environment where you feel like you enjoy being around these people and you have each other's backs and you maybe know a little bit about them personally as well, so you care about them as people, it really boosts the performance of the whole team. And if that's what you're after, it's not fluff. It's not just like, well, they should be working. It shouldn't be fun. And this is what I think, we're getting into a whole other discussion, but, this is what I think Gen Z and younger millennials have done a great job in pushing us to accept, to understand that, like, we're going to spend the bulk of our time at work. Shouldn't it be a place we enjoy being? Shouldn't it be a place where we're seen and heard and respected? And then, man, we're going to do our best work for you. And then ultimately that's going to level up to the goals and the objectives of the organization.
Yeah. These guys all work hard and they work crazy hours when they need to, but
they work hard.
It isn't like, okay, I've got to do this. It's like, okay, we're taking this on. We're excited about it. And it's so inspiring. So I'm so work with them.
They're pushing us. They're pushing us to change the paradigm, and that benefits all of us.
Yeah, I know. It's so fun. And it's so fun to watch people. But the fun thing is we did a retreat and we were having a meal together. So that's one of the things, like she always brings people together and there's food.
Nice.
So people sit and connect with each other. And so here's these guys in their 20s, maybe late 20s, and then the rest go up to the 70s. So every generation. So someone says, oh, you know what my favorite songs are? And so they're talking about their favorite song. They're like country western out of the 50s, 60s. Uh-huh. So they're singing, hey, Sarah, do you know that song? And I looked at her and I says, are you kidding me? I grew up with that song.
Yeah.
Of course I know the lyrics to that song. But they're so energetic and it was so fun. But that's because she creates space for that.
And that's what I mean. That's where you create the environment to actually enable your people to want to be empathetic with each other. And that's what that does. It's not a waste of time.
No, it's great. So let's talk a bit about how you use your love for storytelling through, like, how you communicated through your talks or your empathy training, your leadership training. Where do you put story in there?
So I as a brand strategist, story is very important. It's very important to help create a story where people can see themselves in your story, or at least relate to it. And it's a much better way to get people on board, to engage, to motivate them to take an action. Yes, you want to provide stats and facts and figures, but you want to engage a different part of their brain so that they feel like they can, again, like I said, see themselves in your story, have someone to root for. And so whenever I can in my talks, and I've actually been, thankfully, it's been pointed out to me by people that have referred me or recommended me or endorsed me, They said, I love the way Maria brings personal stories into her work. And I just can't help it because yes, I can do all the research and talk to all the people, but can I layer in some personality? Can I layer in some things from my own life, whether it's from my work life or like I've done in my books, talking a little bit about being a parent or talking about, something that happened in my childhood. Those are the things that connect us as human beings. And then we're more receptive to the message moving forward because we're not just seeing sort of an automaton presenting information. We actually get to know, that's where that vulnerability comes in. You actually get to know someone a little bit better and you're drawn in to whatever it is they're trying to tell you, show you, influence you about, whatever that is. And so I'm a huge proponent in the power of stories to persuade, to ignite, to provoke, to motivate us, to make us think differently about something. And that's why some of my favorite authors are authors who are huge storytellers, even in the nonfiction world, even when they're writing business books. Folks like Chip and Dan Heath, Dan Pink. Like, I love reading their books because they start out every chapter with a story. And then they carry that story through to bring the lessons home of what it is they're trying to teach you. I have tried to emulate that. Hopefully I've succeeded. Dan Pink endorsed this last book, so I'm hoping that I did something right. But yeah.
That is a big endorsement.
But that's why I got into brand strategy, Sarah, because I recognize the power of stories and not to manipulate, not to coerce, not to lie to people. But, like any tool, storytelling can be used for good or for evil, just like, my mantra is always marketing can be used for good, not just evil. And so, you just want to be really thoughtful about the stories that you tell because that can bring it to life and activate a part of your brain that's different than if I just tell you the information.
Thank you. You just helped me reframe something I've been curious about. So I won't go into it because it's really long. So we'll save that for another conversation. So you have something that I have two other questions, but before we go in that direction, because it'll take us out of the podcast, I wanted to ask if you would share with the listeners about your free chapter offer.
Yes, absolutely. So if folks go to theempathydilemma.com, which is a page on my website, so they'll find all the things there. They'll find my podcast and information about me. If they go to theempathydilemma.com and scroll down, they can actually download a free chapter of the new book to check it out and see if they like my writing style, see if they're intrigued to learn more. And so I really just wanted to provide people with a way to get a taste of the book.
And we will have, as you know, listeners, we will have links to all of her contact information. So it'll be in the show notes for you. You don't have to stress about that. So one of the questions I have for you is, we do a thing where we call it return the favor or pay it forward. It just depends on what mood I'm in, what I call it. But the point of it is to share back with a previous podcast guest, whether we've ever met them or not, something they gave you through listening to their episode on the podcast, as I imagine many people would be able to say about you after they listened to this episode. So is there an episode that you listened to that you can share with us and a couple of your ahas from it?
Yes, there were two. And one of them I actually sent to a friend of mine who has started her own nonprofit to help raise funds for more research on childhood cancer. It was actually a recent episode with Eric Newman, Lead with Heart. I think it was number 379. First, he said something really interesting about his own personal story, which is that the word hope helped him transform his life and then build ultimately his pediatric care nonprofit. And I thought, that's part of my work too. That's what people want at work. They want hope. They want energy. They want to succeed. Nobody really just wants to go punch a clock all day. And so can you provide as a leader hope? Can you provide, again, that culture of empathy? So I thought that was really interesting. And then I loved that he creatively married his nonprofit and his for-profit work. So building playgrounds for kids with cancer in their backyard, but then figuring out, hey, who can build these playgrounds? We can actually create team building activities for companies. So they come out and they do a service project together and they build that fifth pillar of joy, which is doing something together. I actually had a guest on my podcast who specializes in that work, Terry Schmidt from Stronger to Serve. They create service experiences that not only build professional development, but build camaraderie and create team bonding in a, sometimes in a better way than like a happy hour will, right? It's something a little bit more accessible for people. So I thought that was great. I have one more though. Transforming Work Culture with Dr. Elise Dubb, 380. I loved how she talked about building skills at work that people can apply to their personal life, because that's exactly what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to make the world more empathetic. When I initially started out, I thought I was going to write this grand book about how to be empathetic in all aspects of your life, your career, your marriage, your parenting, blah, blah. And some very wise mentors said, why don't you stay in a lane? And so I decided to talk about empathy at work, because my sneaky mission is we practice empathy at work, if that's our sandbox for building these empathy skills to get all these great benefits from an organizational perspective. Of course, that's going to spill over in our personal life. We're going to bring that home to our family, to our community, and our world. And so for me, it's about finding that access point. And I thought it was really interesting that she said the exact same thing, this idea of like building these skills that you can use not only at work, but in your life and in the larger world as well.
I like to think of work as the playground, right? Like when you said sandbox, I've actually trademarked sandbox, right? Because we use it for our video production. But because we spend time there. And so we have many opportunities to practice, and we might have that much time to practice at home.
Right. Well, we spend the bulk of our time at work. So let's make it count.
Let's make it count and get some transferable skills.
Yes.
Oh, Maria, it has been a blast getting to talk with you today on the podcast. I'm going to let you take us out of the episode by leaving our listeners with something you want us to remember as we go into our day or the evening, wherever it is when we're listening to this.
Mm-hmm. Well, I guess I'll leave you with my mantra that I close out all my podcast episodes with, and that is cash flow, creativity, and compassion are not mutually exclusive. We can have both and leadership. We don't have to choose between empathy and performance.
You've been listening to the No Labels, No Limits podcast with best-selling author, change agent, and strategic business coach, Sarah Box. You can grab the show notes and find out how to work with Sarah at sarahbox.com/No Labels, No Limits podcast. We'd love this podcast to reach as many people as possible. Please remember to rate, leave a 5-star review, and share the podcast with someone you think would get value from this conversation. Till next time, keep taking those daily action steps to align your purpose to your principles and achieve your goals in business and life.